Thank you. It's really funny to have I guess when you get really important, other people write your bios, but I think most of us write our own bios, and it's this funny thing of writing in the third person. Sascha Dubrul was raised, and I wrote that shit, man. I was like, it just makes it sound like I'm important or something. Okay, there's a lot of things I want to say, and I have 20 minutes, and so I'm going to try my best to get out as much of it as I can. And and also, usually I'm used to sitting in circles with people and talking. I don't have that much experience just talking at people, so hopefully I'll pull it off and I won't be too alienated too. So, like, almost 6 years ago, I wrote this story called The Bipolar World, which ended up sparking this really interesting community of folks called the Icarus Project. And there's people all over the world now who are using the materials that we put together. And the basic idea of the Icarus Project is that we're trying to reframe the way that society thinks of what is considered mental illness. So, like, I'm diagnosed with bipolar disorder, but I think that language is helpful in some circumstances, but really the way I think about myself is someone who has dangerous gifts and I need to learn how to use them. So that's not really what I'm going to talk about, though, because I've been talking about that shit for like a while. I'm going to talk to you about some stuff that I've never tried to talk to people about publicly, and we'll see how it goes. It's kind of intense. Okay, so first off, I'll say that one of the things I've learned from working on the Icarus Project is that all the best stuff, all of like the important stuff, like when it comes down to it, when we're like people, whether you're someone who wants to change the world or you're someone just trying to figure out how to live your life and be happy, all the most important stuff is in the scariest stuff. It's like the stuff you're scared to look at because it freaks you out, because you look at it and something in it makes your mind switch to another track. It's why people who are crazy, people who are mad, a lot of times people get freaked out by folks like that, but it's not necessarily just, because they're scared they're gonna hurt them or something like that. It's because they see something in them that freaks them out because they see it in themselves too and they don't want to admit it. So that's kind of one of a premise that we've been working at with the Icarus Project for a while. I have like 10 things I want us to do. Okay, you should know something about the way that my mind works is that I don't think linearly, I don't write linearly. If you've ever read my stories, I don't write them from the beginning to the end. I start at the beginning and the end, and it's like I piece it together from all these different places. So right now, I was writing a book all winter I didn't finish called The Secret Life of White People, and I don't have the fucking book, but I have all these notes in my head. So I have a bunch of ideas, but I'm just gonna kind of throw them out at you, and you're gonna have to make sense of it the best that you can. Okay. So the scary stuff, story weaving. So we're going to start our story in the year 2000. I was living in the East Bay at a house called the Batcave. A few of you out here know that house. Right.
I've been there twice.
So I lived in this house with a bunch of anarchist folks. We were a bunch of white folks living in a predominantly black neighborhood in North Oakland, a very interesting neighborhood. I just started a project called the Bay Area Seed Interchange Library, and we were going around doing these. It was right after the WTO protest in Seattle, and there was a lot of energy, and there were these global protests happening, and we were talking a lot about taking the power out of the hands of the multinationals and putting them back in the hands of the people, and what I started going around I started talking to my neighbors, okay? And most of my neighbors were black, and so I was living in this white activist house. Most of my neighbors were black. I'd never really talked to folks in that neighborhood before. One of the things I learned almost immediately was that 3 blocks from our house was where the Black Panther 10-point program was written. It was where the old Merritt College building is. It's now a senior center. Everyone that I talked to in the neighborhood, most of them were folks who were they were descended from folks who were from Louisiana or North Carolina and came up during World War II to work in the shipyards. And had either been fed in the free breakfast programs that the Black Panthers did, or were members of the Black Panther Party, or were somehow affiliated. And here I was living in this house of white activists, and we didn't know about that shit. It was like it was funny, because we had this like different background that led us to activism, but it wasn't, there wasn't this overlap, and there wasn't like a way of talking about it. Okay, so this is the, someone have some water or something? I see some water right there.
It's empty. You want me to get you some?
No.
Okay. Alright.
It's got an Icarus sticker on it. Alright, check it out. Here's where the story goes. One night I'm lying in bed and I'm reading the autobiography of Sascha Dubrul. Has anyone read it? Alright, so I'm reading the autobiography of Sascha Dubrul. And it's a very interesting story about this woman who managed to, they said she was a cop killer, she escaped and ended up in Cuba, and she was living in Cuba, putting together this story, writing about her experiences in the Black Liberation Army, and just talking about her experience as a black woman raised in the South and coming up to New York City, and very interesting story. I'm about 3/4 of the way through the book, and I get to this page, and it talks about her daughter Kikuya, who's born in prison, when she's waiting to get sentenced to go to prison. And I suddenly had this flash. I went to elementary school with Kikuya Shakur, Sascha Dubrul's daughter. So, year 2000, lying in bed in the back cave of my house, picture the scene, there's like books about seeds and shit all over the place, and there's like probably food not bombs, stuff going in the kitchen, all that stuff. I'm reading this book, and I suddenly had this flash, and all of a sudden, I go back to elementary school. I grew up in New York City. I grew up in a very multicultural place. Like if you look at elementary school photos from my school, it's like this rainbow diversity of kids. And I'm thinking, Kikuya Shakur, what happened to Kikuya Shakur? And then this was the only memory that I could come up with. 1985, I'm in 5th grade. Kikuya's gone, disappeared. And there's this rumor floating around my class that Kikuya's mother had murdered Martin Luther King. Okay, so that's a little piece. Just so hold on to that. And now we're going to go back to 1985. And I'm briefly going to try and describe to you a little bit about my childhood and the kind of political milieu I came up in. I was raised by democratic socialists. I was raised kind of in the, trying to piece it together now, you know, the left fragmented into all these different pieces. And I was raised in like this little fragment of the left, you know. I was raised when the Cold War, I guess, the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, and the whole kind of way that we think about global capitalism now, when I was a young teenager, it was really different. There was like the communists and the capitalists, and there was this whole, the histories, you know, like, I'm piecing it together now as like in my 30s. I didn't really grasp it when I was younger. But here's what I can tell you, that like the important parts of my childhood. When I was in elementary school, I was taught that it was really important. There was this famous speech. We would learn about the civil rights movement in school, and we would learn that Martin Luther King, I don't know how many, I'm assuming, I grew up in the 80s, like Martin Luther King's birthday was signed into a holiday in 1983 by Ronald Reagan. I'm not sure like about you all when you went to school and what you learned, but we learned about the civil rights movement. And we learned not to judge people by I'm quoting Martin Luther King, not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. This is how I was raised by my family and by the school I went to. And so, growing up, race was this thing that we didn't really fucking talk about, you know? And I know enough about the world to know that like a lot of you grew up in this same world too. It's like this way that like race was this thing that was like not really discussed. So yeah, fragments of the left, elementary school, Kikuya Shakur. Let's move on to like me at 14 years old hanging out with a bunch of anarchists. When I was 14 years old, I started hanging out in this neighborhood on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and for the first time in my life, after being a really alienated kid, I suddenly had all these friends. And mostly punk kids. There was all these kids that would run away from home. And it it was mostly white kids. It was like mixed up too. It was New York City. It's a pretty multicultural place, but it was a predominantly white scene. And we didn't like have a language. When we talked about race, we would talk about the fucking racist skinheads and like we were talking. You know, I would hang out at this place ABC in Rio, which is. And a place in Gilman Street, they're similar kind of places that had these policies: no racist, no sexist, no homophobic. We were taught like we were very much, we were anti-racist, but we didn't actually have analysis of race or our place in it or whiteness or white people. And I think yeah, I don't have a lot of thoughts on it. There's a lot of other people here in this room that have a lot of thoughts on it, but we're not going to go there. I'm going to give you these little pieces, and then I'll try and tie it together. So the next piece, all right, is I'm in my early 20s, and I've dropped out of college, and I'm riding around the country on freight trains, and I've lived down in Central America for half a year, and worked on the border of Guatemala and Mexico with refugees who left their villages because there were massacres there in the 80s, and got in school, but I was this white kid traveling around, and I was writing these stories. I had this big plan. I was going to write stories about guys from Mexico and Central America that were riding around on freight trains looking for work. It was like I thought it was a really interesting story. I'd ended up riding freight trains along the Pacific coast of Mexico, and had this whole experience of being on a freight train with like 100-something people who were all trying to cross the border, and I thought it was a really interesting story. So one night, I'm in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I'm at a truck stop trying to catch a ride, and I meet this Mexican guy. His name's Sergio, and he had really light skin. He was Mexican, and we're talking. And I'm telling him about this project that I'm doing. I'm writing stories about Mexican people. And he says, oh, that's really funny, because he was white. He looked white, so he worked with white people. And he says, oh, that's really funny that you want to write a story for white people about Mexicans. I think I'm going to write a book called La vida secreta de los gabachos, The Secret Life of White People. So, it just stuck, you know? I mean, it just like, so that was a long time ago, but like, all this time later, sometimes, I don't know about you all, but for me, like, words are very powerful, and sometimes they like sear their way into my head, and I come back to them over and over again, and like, I don't know about you all, but for me, because I'm a writer, I carry around these stories with me, and they kind of become, I carry this like own like little personal mythology I have about how things are and how things have been. And things are very complicated, like the world is very complicated. Like, for example, I showed up here a couple days ago and immediately got miserably depressed. And remembered all this, like the Bay Area, I think of this as like wonderful place where all these friends of mine are. And then I had this realization, oh, actually, the reason we started the Icarus Project was because I felt totally unsupported by my friends. You know, and still, like, all this time later, a bunch of that pain is still there. Okay. I don't know how much time I have, but I'm just gonna like throw some things at you, and you're gonna do what you're gonna do with it, you know? I've never talked about this stuff in front of a whole bunch of people, but this is fucking intense. You ready? You ready? Yeah. All right. Okay. When I was 24 years old, I went back home to New York. I hadn't been home in a really long time, and I'd been traveling for 3 years, all over the place. Working on different political campaigns, riding freight trains, like having adventures. There's all these people who knew who I was, who had been writing zines. I had like kind of like an identity that I'd created for myself of this person. And I went home to New York, and it was at the height of the Giuliani administration. I don't know how many of you know, but like back in the 90s, we had this mayor who totally transformed the face of our city. And I started working with all these community gardeners, because Giuliani put like more than 1,000 gardens up on the auction block. There were all these, you know, in the late 70s, New York went through this big fiscal crisis. There was all like whole neighborhoods that burned down, like landlords would torch the buildings. to collect the insurance money. Like the city has like transformed immensely since, you know, since I was a kid. But so there I was, 24 years old, hanging out in the South Bronx in, at this building called Casa del Sol, which I know some people know. It was like a squat that stuck around for a while. The South Bronx is not that far from where I grew up. I grew up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. It's just a bicycle ride away. But they're like, you might as well be in different worlds. I mean, there's just like, the class differences are really striking and intense. So there I was, 24-year-old Sascha, gets back to New York, is like, has this plan, I'm only going to be in town for a little while, just making some money to go traveling. And all of a sudden, I get back to the neighborhood I'm from, and I start remembering where I'm from, that elementary school that I went to. And I start seeing, I'm like walking down the street, and I start seeing these black ladies pushing little white babies in strollers. And I had this realization that, oh my God, I was one of those little white babies getting pushed in a stroller by a Jamaican nanny. I didn't talk about that to my friends, you know? Like I had this realization, I just like suddenly had this like, all of a sudden, it's like this. It's like, sometimes, I don't know about you all, but sometimes I'm telling a story and I realize halfway through the story that it's actually a made-up story. It's actually like a story that I made up because I didn't actually want to deal with what was underneath the story, and I'm telling it and I'm like, oh shit, wait, I made that story up. And sometimes I say, oh, you know what, actually I made that up, but usually I don't. Usually I just kind of go along with it and then wonder what's underneath there that I didn't want to tell that was in this made-up story. So picture my life having all like this layers and layers of stories, of ideas of the person that I was, and then all of a sudden like being forced to look underneath them and go, wait a minute, actually I'm full of shit. You know, like I'm a liar and I'm a hypocrite, and I'm like why would anyone ever want to talk to me? you know, and so when I was 24 years old, I ended up in a situation where I was walking around the streets of New York City. I had all these projects that I got all these people excited about. We'd started this seed library thing up where I'd been living on the West Coast, and I suddenly was like incapacitated with like self-hatred, basically. And one of the things that happens to me when I get into a really fucked up headspace is that the noise in my head gets louder, and I start to hear things. Some people call it hearing voices. You know, some people like in the world of mental health, you know, they talk about people like, you know, you hear a voice in your head. If you hear a voice that comes from outside and you don't think it's part of you, that's like there's these different categorizations of it or whatever. I hear voices in my head. I hear voices in my head all the fucking time. In fact, the more I pay attention to them, the more they're there, and I have this sense that there's actually like a whole fucking thing going on. You know, it's like there's a whole ecology of myself, of different people. And some people have theories about trauma, and about how when you're a kid, fucked up shit happens to you, and you end up getting, you know, like little pieces of you split off. And then I have a friend who talks about the school bus full of screaming children that we all carry around, you know, that have have all these demands, you know. So when I was going through what ended up being like this period of being suicidally depressed. I don't know if any of you have ever been suicidally depressed, but it's really, really bad. You know, when you're suicidally depressed, you can be anywhere. You can be around your friends, you can be in a space that you would think would be really comfortable, but all you can think about is killing yourself and how much you want to die. And usually how the repeating thought loop of I'm so fucking depressed and I'm such a mess that I can't even get it together to kill myself, you know, and then that just feeds the suicidal loop, you know. So when I was like, have only a couple minutes, so I can't really do justice really to what I'm trying to say here. So I'm gonna wrap it up, and this is how I'm gonna do it. I have a lot of faith in the people who are crazy. I have a lot of faith in people who don't think like normal people think. I think that the ones who are fucked up, I think the ones who have been through the most trauma and who are holding all this pain inside of themselves are actually the ones who have the keys to the answers that we need to change the world. And I think that what's considered normal and what's considered proper behavior are all things that are killing us. And I'm really interested in, as Martin Luther King said, he made this whole series of speeches where he talked about how human salvation lies in the hands of the creatively maladjusted. And I think that there's something really interesting there. And I'm 33 years old now. For the last 6 years I've been working on this thing called the Icarus Project. It has been a whole other adventure that has been through, I get challenged regularly. I don't know how many of you work in collectives, but working group process and having a larger community, it is a really intense thing, and it's a very intense thing to be out there in the world and to try and figure out with your friends how to get along with each other, and then how to get along in a larger place, and actually be try and model behavior that is going to get us out of the holes that we're in, you know. And I think the stuff that we come up against over and over again in the Icarus Project is the same stuff that people come up against in every other organization, but we're all fucking crazy and intense people, so it ends up we end up hitting against each other, you know. In some ways, it kind of proves what I'm trying to say, I think, and that the people who are the most intense are the, if we can figure out how to get along with each other, we kind of bring stuff right to the front. I'm really interested in talking about race, and I'm really interested in talking about class. I got a lot of thoughts, and I've been thinking about it for years, and over this last period of time I've been hanging out in my room and reading books and talking to my friends about it. There's a bunch of people in the Bay Area who are talking about race and class in ways that I think are really interesting and productive, and I'm really interested in adding to that dialogue. And if I had more time, I would tie this all together brilliantly, but since I don't, I'm not going to. But I have all these zines and stuff, and I'm going to go out in the sunshine in a bit and set up out there. And if people are interested in talking to me, you can talk to me. So there you go. And I feel like I'm just going to say, the process of writing is really, I think, one of the most painful things I know, And for me, it's like holding up a mirror to my face, and having to look at really scary, ugly shit. And it's all worth it in the end when you have a piece of writing to be able to share with people. But I'm at this point, if you were to draw me as a cartoon character right now, there would be these little fragments of stuff all swirling around my head. So that's the state that I'm in right now. But I really, thank you all for listening to me. I can tell, I can see in your, a bunch of your faces that you're listening to me, and it's fucking awesome. So that's it. Thank you very much. Sascha Dubrul is next.